Lyrian Night Whisper stood at the edge of the observation deck and watched the human colony below with eyes that had seen 3,000 years of galactic history, and yet she found herself confused by what she witnessed now. The colony world called New Haven sprawled across the valley like a painting made of light and green spaces, and the strange thing was that it actually seemed peaceful and real, and not some trap or deception like she had expected when she first arrived. Beside her stood Vex, and his massive scaled form barely fit in the observation area meant for smaller species, and his ancient amber eyes tracked the same scenes below with an intensity that spoke of predator instincts honed over millennia. They had been watching for 3 days now, and Lyrian still could not understand these humans. The reports had been clear enough, and the newest species to join the Andromeda Coalition had made contact only 50 years ago. And they traded peacefully, and they built colonies that welcomed all species, and they seemed to have no interest in conquest or domination. That alone made them suspicious. Every species Lyrian had encountered in her long life eventually showed their true nature, and the peaceful ones were usually the first to die when the strong decided to take what they wanted, and yet the humans thrived. She watched as human children played in a park below, and they ran alongside Kryn younglings, whose species was known for aggressive territorial behavior. And there were even a few Zelthian traders whose people had raided human ships just 5 years ago. The humans acted as if none of that history mattered. A human woman in a dark blue uniform approached them, and she moved with careful respect for Vex, who could swallow her whole without effort. The woman spoke with a calm voice, and Lyrian noticed she kept her hands visible and relaxed. The human introduced herself as Captain Katie Brennan of the exploration vessel Wandering Star, and she commanded the orbital defense station above the colony. Lyrian studied her carefully, and Katie had brown hair tied back efficiently and dark eyes that seemed to notice everything, and she carried no visible weapons. That was another thing that bothered Lyrian, and the humans rarely carried weapons in their civilian areas, and they had regulations about it, and they seemed to actually follow those regulations. Katie smiled and asked if they were finding everything they needed during their visit. Lyrian responded that they were simply observing and learning about human culture before making their report to the Silver Moon Imperium. Katie nodded and said they were welcome to stay as long as they wished, and the festival starting tomorrow would showcase many different cultures, including human traditions from Earth. Vex made a low rumbling sound that might have been interest or warning, and Lyrian could not tell which. After Katie left them, Vex spoke in the ancient language of dragons that only Lyrian could understand, and he said that something felt wrong about these humans. Lyrian asked what he sensed. Vex shifted his massive wings and said they moved like prey, but watched like predators, and their colony had too many redundancies and too many backup systems for a simple, peaceful outpost. Lyrian had noticed that too. And the power grid had triple backups, and the communication arrays could switch between 7 different systems, and the roads were wide enough for military vehicles, even though only civilian transports used them. She remembered her own people from before the fall, and the elves had been warriors once, and they had conquered 12 systems, and they had been proud and strong, and then they had grown soft. The Silver Moon Imperium had believed itself untouchable, and they stopped training their warriors properly, and they focused on art and philosophy and culture instead of defense. When the Kryn Dominion attacked 200 years ago, her people had nearly been wiped out, and billions died before they remembered how to fight, and by then it was too late to save most of their worlds. Now the elves lived in scattered outposts and hidden bases, and they watched other species make the same mistakes. Lyrian had been sent to observe the humans because the Consortium War was coming, and everyone in the galaxy knew it, and the Kryn Dominion had been growing bolder, and the Zelthian clans were forming alliances, and the old powers were choosing sides. The question was whether humans would be victims or survivors when the war finally began. The festival the next day surprised Lyraean even more than the peaceful colony had. Thousands of beings from dozens of species gathered in the central plaza, and humans had prepared food from 100 different worlds, and there was music and dancing and children of every species playing together. A human woman named Dr. Amy Collins approached them, and she was a scientist who studied alien biology, and she seemed genuinely excited to meet both an ancient elf and a living dragon. Amy talked quickly about her research and how she hoped to establish cultural exchange programs and how amazing it was that so many species could gather peacefully. Lyraean listened and wondered if this woman had ever seen war. Another human joined them, and this one introduced herself as Lieutenant Megan Torres, and she was head of security for the colony. Megan moved differently than Amy, and her steps were measured and balanced, and her eyes constantly scanned the crowd. Even while she smiled and talked casually, Lyraean recognized a warrior when she saw one, and Megan had training that went far beyond simple security work. When Lyraean commented on this, Megan just smiled and said that everyone in human space received basic defense training and it was considered a civic responsibility. That made sense from a practical standpoint. But Lyraean noticed that Megan had stopped smiling when she said it, and there was something in her eyes that spoke of experience and loss. The festival continued into the evening, and Lyraean found herself actually enjoying some of it, and Vex allowed a group of brave human children to approach him, and he even let them touch his scales, which shocked Lyraean because Vex normally tolerated no one but her one child asked if Vex had ever fought in battles. Vex looked down at the small human and spoke in the common tongue which surprised everyone because dragons rarely spoke to anyone outside their bonded partners. Vex said yes, he had fought many battles long ago when the galaxy was younger and more violent. The child asked if fighting was scary. Vex was quiet for a moment, and then said that fighting was necessary sometimes, but it should never be the first choice, and the strongest warriors were those who knew when not to fight. Lyraean felt pride in her old friend, and he had learned much over their centuries together. As the stars came out above the festival, Lyraean stood with Katie again, and the human captain had been making rounds to ensure everyone felt welcome. Katie looked up at the night sky and said something that stuck with Lyraean. She said that humans had learned a hard lesson long ago when they nearly destroyed themselves in wars on Earth, and they had built weapons that could burn their whole world, and they came very close to using them. Katie said that humans decided then that they would choose peace whenever possible, and they would build instead of destroy, and they would welcome others instead of conquering them. But Katie also said that the choice to be peaceful required strength, not weakness, and you had to be capable of defending yourself, or else your peace meant nothing. Lyraean asked what humans would do if someone threatened their peace. Katie turned to look at her, and her dark eyes were suddenly very serious, and she said that humans would try every possible diplomatic solution first, and they would negotiate and compromise and seek understanding. Then Katie said, but if someone refused all of that and chose violence anyway, then humans would respond. There was something in the way Katie said it that made Vex rumble low in his chest, and Lyraean felt a chill despite the warm evening air. Before Lyraean could ask more, alarms began to sound across the colony, and red lights flickered on in designated areas, and people began moving with surprising organization toward shelters. Katie pulled out a communication device and listened to a rapid report, and her face remained calm, but her jaw tightened. She looked at Lyraean and said that a Kryn Dominion fleet had just entered the system, and they were demanding the colony surrender. Lyraean felt her heart sink, and the Kryn were known for their brutality, and they took slaves and burned worlds that resisted. Katie spoke into her communicator with a steady voice and ordered all military personnel to their stations and all civilians to designated shelters, and she authorized the activation of defense protocols. Then Katie turned back to Lyraean and asked if she and Vex would be willing to help evacuate civilians, since a dragon could carry many people quickly. Lyraean agreed immediately, and Vex lowered himself to allow people to climb onto his back. As they worked through the night, helping move people to safety, Lyraean watched the humans transform and the peaceful festival atmosphere vanished, and suddenly everyone moved with purpose and efficiency. Soldiers appeared from nowhere, and they wore armor that had definitely not been visible during the festival, and defensive positions were established with practiced speed. Dr. Amy Collins, the excited scientist, was now coordinating evacuation routes with military precision. Lieutenant Megan Torres was directing combat teams with the ease of someone who had done this many times before, and Captain Katie Brennan stood at the command center orchestrating everything with calm authority. Lyraean realized then that the humans had been ready for this all along, and every smiling face at the festival had been a trained defender, and every peaceful building had been a potential fortress. As dawn broke over New Haven, Lyraean watched human ships take defensive positions in orbit, and she listened to Katie trying one more time to negotiate with the Kryn commander. The Kryn response was to destroy an unarmed transport shuttle carrying refugees. Katie closed her eyes for just a moment and then opened them again, and when she gave her next orders, her voice was cold and hard. She ordered all civilians evacuated within 6 hours, and she authorized something called Protocol Fenrir, and she sent a message to Earth with a Code Black designation. Lyraean asked what Fenrir meant. Katie looked at her and said it meant they had tried to be gentle. Then Katie walked away to prepare for war, and Lyraean stood with Vex watching the human colony transform, and she finally understood what Vex had sensed from the beginning. These humans were not prey, pretending to be predators, and they were predators who had chosen to be gentle. And there was a massive difference between the two. The Kryn Dominion fleet hung in orbit like a storm waiting to break, and High Commander Zarthok stood on his command deck studying the human colony below with satisfaction. His intelligence reports had been clear, and humans were a weak species that preferred trade to combat, and they welcomed even their enemies into their settlements, and they would surrender quickly when faced with superior force. Zarthok had conquered 47 worlds, using exactly this approach, and he would demand surrender, and the weak species would comply, and if they resisted, he would make an example of a few thousand civilians, and the rest would fall in line. This colony of 20,000 would provide excellent slaves for the Dominion mines, and the humans could be broken easily enough. He opened a channel to the planet below and transmitted his demands in the common tongue, and the colony would surrender all weapons and provide 10,000 workers for immediate transport, and the rest would pay tribute to the Dominion. A human woman appeared on his screen, and she introduced herself as Ambassador Lisa Patterson, and she asked if they could discuss terms peacefully. Zarthok laughed, and there were no terms to discuss, and she had 1 hour to comply, or he would begin orbital bombardment. Ambassador Patterson remained calm, and she suggested that perhaps both sides could benefit from trade agreements instead, and humans had advanced medical technology and agricultural systems that the Kryn might find valuable. Zarthok ended the transmission, and these humans were even weaker than he had expected. Below on the surface, Lyraean watched the diplomatic exchange from the command center where Katie had allowed her to observe, and she had seen this pattern before with other species. The strong made demands and the weak tried to negotiate, and then the strong took what they wanted. Except the humans did not seem panicked by the rejection, and Katie simply nodded when the transmission ended and began giving new orders. Lieutenant Nicole Hayes was coordinating defensive positions, and she marked targets on tactical displays and assigned fire sectors with casual efficiency. Dr. Amy Collins had moved to a different station, and Lyraean realized the friendly scientist was actually coordinating an entire network of sensor arrays and tracking every ship in the Kryn fleet. Amy noticed Lyraean watching and smiled and said that she really did love biology, but her doctorate was actually in tactical analysis, and the biology was just her hobby. Lyraean felt another piece of her understanding shift. Megan Torres arrived with a status report, and all civilians were evacuated to underground shelters, and all defense teams were in position, and something called the Ranger units had deployed to strategic locations. Katie acknowledged the report and asked if the special package from Earth had arrived. Megan confirmed that Admiral Lauren Mitchell was 3 hours out with reinforcements. Lyrian asked why the humans were preparing to fight when they could still try to negotiate. Katie looked at her with tired eyes and said they would absolutely continue trying to negotiate right up until the shooting started, and Ambassador Patterson was genuinely attempting to find a peaceful solution. But Katie also said that hope was not a strategy, and humans prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. Another transmission came through, and Ambassador Patterson was offering the Kryn access to human agricultural technology that could increase their crop yields by 40%. Zarthok appeared on screen again and said he would take their technology after he took their world, and he gave them 30 minutes to surrender. Patterson asked for more time to consult with her government. Zarthok granted her 10 minutes. When the channel closed, Katie spoke quietly to someone off-screen and authorized the activation of orbital defense platforms. Lyraean had not known the colony had orbital platforms, and she said as much. Katie explained that every human colony maintained defensive systems, but they kept them powered down and hidden unless needed, and it was part of their peaceful approach and show no weapons unless forced to use them. Vex rumbled from where he rested in the corner of the command center and said that humans thought like dragons used to before his kind grew proud and careless. Katie smiled slightly and said she would take that as a compliment. The 10 minutes passed, and Ambassador Patterson made one more attempt, and she offered the Kryn a non-aggression pact and mutual defense agreement and even economic assistance. Zarthok responded by ordering his ships to target the underground shelters. Then he fired on a medical transport that was clearly marked with rescue symbols. The ship broke apart in orbit, and 73 people died instantly. The command center went absolutely silent. Lyraean watched Katie, and the human captain stood very still for maybe 5 seconds, and then she began giving orders in a voice that had no emotion at all. Katie ordered all defense platforms online and all ships to combat status and all ground forces to engage on her mark. She sent a priority message to Admiral Mitchell to proceed with maximum speed. Then Katie opened a channel to the Kryn fleet. She spoke calmly and said that the Kryn Dominion had rejected all peaceful options and had deliberately targeted civilians and medical personnel. Katie said that under coalition law and human regulations, this constituted a war crime, and the human response would be proportional and overwhelming. She gave the Kryn fleet one final chance to withdraw. Zarthok laughed and said the humans could not even defend themselves properly. Katie closed the channel and looked at her crew and said something Lyraean would never forget. She said they had tried to be gentle and tried to find peace and tried to show mercy, and now it was time to remind the galaxy why Earth had once nearly destroyed itself. Katie said to engage all targets. The orbital platforms powered up, and Lyraean saw on the tactical displays that there were not 3 or 4 platforms, but 27 of them, and they had been hidden among civilian satellites and commercial stations. The Kryn fleet detected them immediately and began evasive maneuvers, but the human weapons were already firing. Lyraean watched in shock as the first salvo tore through Kryn shields, like they were not even there, and 3 ships exploded in the opening seconds. Zarthok was screaming orders on the command channel and demanding to know how the humans had such powerful weapons. Katie did not bother to respond. The Wandering Star and 6 other human ships that had been docked at the colony suddenly powered up and moved into combat formation, and Lyraean realized these exploration vessels had military-grade weapons hidden in their hulls. Dr. Amy Collins was calling out targeting solutions and tracking every Kryn ship movement, and her cheerful demeanor had been replaced by cold focus. Lieutenant Nicole Hayes coordinated the defense platforms and synchronized their fire with the ships and created overlapping fields that the Kryn could not escape. The battle was not even close. The Kryn had numbers, but the humans had preparation and technology, and most importantly, they had been ready for this. Zarthok sent a landing force to the surface, and he must have thought he could at least capture the colony itself if he could not hold orbit. That was when the humans revealed their ground defenses. Buildings that had looked like simple residential structures opened up to reveal anti-aircraft batteries, and the parks where children had played yesterday contained hidden missile launchers, and the roads that seemed too wide suddenly made sense when armored vehicles emerged from underground garages. Megan Torres led the ground defense, and Lyraean watched through the command center displays as human soldiers moved with precision that spoke of years of training. A group of soldiers in different uniforms appeared on one screen, and Amy said those were Rangers, and they were humans who specialized in extreme situations. The Rangers moved through the Kryn landing forces like ghosts, and they struck from unexpected angles and disappeared before the Kryn could respond effectively. Lyraean had seen many battles in her long life, but she had never seen anything quite like this, and the humans fought with a controlled brutality that was somehow more terrifying than raw violence. They did not charge forward in rage, and they did not make grand gestures or waste movements, and they simply identified targets and eliminated them with mechanical efficiency. Vex spoke quietly and said, now he understood what he had sensed in the humans. He said they were not predators who had learned to pretend to be peaceful, and they were predators who had learned to actually be peaceful, but who remembered exactly how to hunt when necessary. 4 hours into the battle, Admiral Lauren Mitchell arrived with a fleet of 20 human warships. The Kryn fleet was already breaking apart, and half their ships were disabled or destroyed, and the rest were trying to retreat. Admiral Mitchell opened a channel to the remaining Kryn ships, and her voice was calm but firm. She said the Kryn Dominion had one chance to surrender and accept coalition justice for their war crimes, or they would be eliminated. Completely. Zarthok tried to negotiate, and suddenly he wanted to talk terms and discuss peaceful resolution. Admiral Mitchell cut him off and said the time for negotiation had been before he killed civilians, and now he only had the choice between surrender and death. Most of the Kryn fleet surrendered, and a few tried to run, and the human ships destroyed them without hesitation. Zarthok himself attempted to escape in a small craft, but a ranger team led by a woman named Ashley Grant intercepted him on the surface. Lyraean watched through the combat feeds as Ashley and her team captured the Kryn commander alive, despite his attempts to fight back, and they did it without killing a single one of his personal guards. That struck Lyraean as significant, and the humans were angry enough to destroy the entire fleet, but disciplined enough to take prisoners when possible. After the battle ended, Katie stood at her command station and supervised the recovery operations, and medical teams were already treating wounded Kryn soldiers alongside wounded humans. Lyraean approached her and asked how humans could be so gentle with their enemies. After what the Kryn had done, Katie looked exhausted, and she said that the Kryn soldiers were following orders, and many of them probably had no choice in being here, and punishing them would serve no purpose. Then Katie said that humans would absolutely punish those responsible for war crimes, and Zarthok would face justice, and the Dominion leadership would answer for their actions. But Katie said individual soldiers who surrendered would be treated according to coalition law, and that meant medical care and fair treatment. Lyraean finally asked the question that had been bothering her since the battle began. She asked Katie how long the humans had been preparing for this. Katie smiled tiredly and said that humans had been preparing for exactly this kind of scenario since the day they joined the coalition. She explained that humans had learned from their own history that peace required strength, and that appearing weak invited attack, and so every human colony maintained hidden defenses, and every civilian ship had military capabilities, and every citizen received defense training. Katie said humans genuinely wanted peace, and they built parks and schools, and welcomed other species, and they meant all of it sincerely. But Katie also said that humans had nearly exterminated themselves once, and they would never allow another species to do what they had almost done to themselves. Lyraean understood then, and she thought of her own people and how they had forgotten this lesson. The elves had been powerful once, but they had grown so confident in their peace that they forgot how to defend it. When the Kryn had attacked her people 200 years ago, the elves had been unprepared, and billions died before they remembered how to fight. Humans had taken the opposite approach, and they remembered their violent past and prepared for it, while hoping they would never need those preparations. Lirayan made a decision. Then she told Katie that she would send her report to the Silver Moon Imperium and recommend a full alliance with humanity. She also said that she and Vex would remain here to help defend against the inevitable Kryn retaliation. Katie looked surprised and asked why Lyran would risk herself for a human colony. Lyran looked at Vex and then back at Katie and said, because she had finally found a species that understood what her people had forgotten. She said the strongest warriors were not those who never stopped fighting, but those who knew when not to fight. And she said that humans terrified her because they remembered how to be monsters but chose not to be. Katie nodded slowly and said that was probably the best compliment anyone had ever given her species. As night fell over New Haven again, Lirayan stood with Vex and watched the repairs beginning and human, and Kryn worked side by side under guard to clear debris. Tomorrow, the Consortium War would continue, and more battles would come, and the galaxy would have to choose sides. But tonight, Lirayan had hope for the first time in 2 centuries. She had found allies who understood that true strength came from choosing peace while being fully capable of war. The Kryn Dominion response came exactly 6 days after their fleet was destroyed at New Haven, and this time they sent 3 full battle groups. High Marshal Krenthax commanded the retaliation force, and he was determined to make an example of the humans who had embarrassed the Dominion. Lirayan stood in the command center beside Katie and watched the massive Kryn fleet emerge from dimensional gates at the edge of the system. There were over 100 ships, and this was 10 times the force that had attacked before, and Krenthax was not interested in negotiations. His first transmission was simple and direct, and he would burn the colony to ash and take the survivors as slaves, and the Dominion would show the galaxy what happened to those who resisted. Katie listened without expression and then closed the channel without responding. Lirayan asked if the humans would evacuate. Katie shook her head and said, evacuation would take too long with this many ships. And besides, Admiral Mitchell had arrived 3 days ago with reinforcements. Lirayan had not realized the Admiral was still here, and she asked how many ships the humans had. Katie pulled up a tactical display and showed 37 human vessels in various positions around the system. Lirayan felt her heart sink, and the humans were outnumbered 3-1, and this was not the easy victory that the first battle had been. Then Katie smiled slightly and said, numbers were not everything. She activated a communication to all human ships and ground forces, and her message was brief. Katie said the Kryn had chosen war crimes over peace and slavery over cooperation, and now they would learn why humans had protocols for this exact situation. She authorized full combat operations and removed all restrictions on defensive systems. Lirayan watched as the human colony transformed again, but this time it was different and more complete. Every building revealed weapon systems, and every park contained hidden launchers, and the entire colony was a fortress that had been disguised as a peaceful settlement. Katie explained that human colonies were designed with multiple purposes, and they could function as civilian centers during peace and military strongholds during war. Dr. Amy Collins arrived at the command center, and she was wearing combat armor now and carried weapons that seemed too advanced for a simple biologist. Amy saw Lirayan looking and explained cheerfully that all human scientists received military training, and her particular specialty was tactical analysis, which was very useful in both research and combat. Lieutenant Megan Torres was coordinating ground forces, and she had organized the Rangers into strike teams and positioned regular military units at strategic points. A new officer appeared that Lyraean had not seen before, and Katie introduced her as Dr. Stephanie Ward, who ran the research station. Stephanie looked like a friendly academic, but she moved like a soldier, and she reported that all experimental weapons were online and ready for field testing. Lyraean asked what experimental weapons meant. Stephanie grinned and said humans never stopped developing new technology, and every research station doubled as a weapons development facility, and they had some interesting surprises for the Kryn. The battle began when the Kryn fleet entered weapons range and they opened fire on the orbital platforms, expecting to destroy them quickly. The platforms activated shields that had not been present in the last battle, and the Kryn weapons splashed harmlessly against defensive barriers. Then the platforms returned fire, and the weapons that emerged were nothing like what had been used before Lyraean watched, as beams of coherent energy tore through Kryn ships, and the energy seemed to ignore their shields completely and cut through armor, like it was not even there. Amy explained that humans had been studying Kryn shield technology and developed weapons specifically designed to counter them. The Kryn fleet scattered and tried to flank the platforms, but human ships intercepted them, and these vessels moved faster than the Kryn had anticipated. Admiral Mitchell commanded the human fleet from her flagship, and she coordinated their movements with precision that came from years of experience. The Wandering Star led a group of lighter vessels against the Kryn right flank, and Katie commanded her ship remotely while staying at the colony to coordinate overall defense. A large group of Kryn ships broke through toward the planet, and Krenthax must have decided that destroying the colony was worth losing ships. Megan Torres activated ground defenses, and the entire surface of New Haven lit up with weapons fire. Missiles streaked into space and energy, weapons created a defensive screen, and point defense systems shot down incoming Kryn ordnance. With mechanical precision, Lyraean had defended many worlds in her long life, but she had never seen anything like this, and the humans had turned an entire planet into a weapon Vex had taken to the air with a human pilot named Lieutenant Rachel Kim, and they worked together to intercept Kryn fighters that made it through the defensive screen. Rachel flew her combat aircraft in formation with Vex, and they covered each other and communicated through a headset that Rachel wore. Lyraean watched through the combat feeds as her ancient companion fought alongside humans, and Vex seemed to enjoy having allies who could keep up with him. The battle raged for hours, and the Kryn fleet was taking heavy losses, but they kept coming, and Krenthax was willing to sacrifice his entire force to destroy the colony. Then something unexpected happened. A group of Kryn ships suddenly changed course and started firing on their own fleet. Stephanie Ward laughed and explained that human cyber warfare teams had infiltrated the Kryn command network and taken control of several ships. Amy added that they had also downloaded the complete Kryn battle plans and strategic databases, which would be very useful for future conflicts. The Kryn fleet began to collapse and ships were breaking formation and trying to retreat, but the humans had positioned vessels to block the escape routes. Admiral Mitchell opened a channel to Krenthax and offered him one chance to surrender. Krenthax refused and swore that the Dominion would send 10 fleets next time and 100 fleets if needed, and they would never stop until humanity was destroyed. Mitchell closed the channel and gave orders to eliminate Krenthax's flagship. 3 human ships converged on the massive Kryn command vessel, and their combined fire overwhelmed its defenses in under a minute. The flagship exploded and took Krenthax with it. The rest of the Kryn fleet immediately signaled surrender. Katie ordered all ships to cease fire and accept the Kryn surrender and begin recovery operations for survivors. Lyraean was amazed that the humans could switch from total war to humanitarian rescue so quickly. She said as much to Katie. Katie explained that humans separated the war from the warriors, and they fought hard when necessary, but they did not hate their enemies, and once the fighting stopped, they treated everyone according to law and basic decency. Over the next several days, Lyraean watched the aftermath of the battle, and it was in many ways more impressive than the fighting itself. Human medical teams treated thousands of wounded Kryn soldiers and gave them the same care they gave their own wounded. Human engineers helped repair damaged Kryn ships enough for them to make it to designated prisoner processing stations. Human interrogators questioned Kryn officers but did not torture them, and they offered better treatment for those who cooperated. Most shocking of all was when a young Kryn officer asked to speak with Katie directly. The officer said his name was Vren, and he had been conscripted into the Dominion military against his will, and many Kryn felt the same way Vren said the Dominion leadership ruled through fear and oppression, and most Kryn would welcome liberation from their own government. Katie listened carefully and then did something that surprised everyone. She offered Vren and any other Kryn who wanted it asylum in human space and protection from Dominion retaliation. Over the next week, more than 3,000 Kryn soldiers and crew members accepted the offer. This created a diplomatic crisis, and the Dominion demanded their people back and threatened even more. Retaliation. Katie forwarded the demands to Earth and waited for instructions. The response came from President Helen Wright herself, and the human leader gave a short statement that was broadcast across the galaxy. President Wright said that any being who sought freedom from oppression would find sanctuary in human space, and that humanity would defend those who could not defend themselves. She also said that if the Kryn Dominion attacked again, they would find themselves facing not just human forces, but a coalition of free species who had united against tyranny. It was a bold statement, and it changed everything. Within days, other species began requesting human protection, and colonies that had been bullied by the Dominion suddenly had hope. The Silver Moon Imperium officially allied with humanity, and Lerayan was named the primary liaison between their people's. Vex became something of a legend among humans, and stories spread about the ancient dragon who fought alongside them and protected their pilots. Rachel Kim became Vex's official partner for combat operations, and they developed a bond that reminded Lerayan of her own connection with her dragon. One evening, Lerayan sat with Katie watching the sunset over New Haven, and the colony was already being rebuilt, and it would be stronger than before. Lerayan asked Katie if she was afraid of what would come next. Katie admitted she was, and the Dominion would not stop, and more battles were coming, and some humans would die defending their principles. But Katie also said that fear was not a reason to abandon those principles. She said humans had learned that the hard way, and there had been times in their history when they chose convenience over morality and power over justice, and it had always led to tragedy. Katie said modern humans tried to do better, and they tried to be the species they wished they had been in the past. Lerayan understood, and she told Katie about the fall of the Silver Moon Imperium and how her people had been powerful warriors who grew arrogant. She explained that elves had believed themselves superior to other species, and they had shown mercy to some enemies not out of compassion but out of contempt. When those enemies grew strong enough to fight back, the elves had been unprepared and billions died, and her civilization nearly ended. Lerayan said the difference between humans and elves was that humans chose mercy from strength, while elves had offered it from arrogance. Katie thought about that and said maybe that was why humans prepared so carefully for war while hoping for peace. She said they knew they were capable of terrible things, and they had proven it throughout their history, and so they built systems and rules and principles to control those capabilities. Vex joined them and spoke in the common tongue, which he still did, rarely. He said humans reminded him of dragons in the ancient times before his kind grew proud. He said the oldest dragons had been the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy, but they chose to be wise instead of destructive. He said some dragons forgot that lesson and became tyrants, and those dragons were gone now, and only a few remained who remembered the old ways. Vex said he saw the same choice facing humanity, and they could become tyrants, or they could become something better. Katie smiled and said humans were trying very hard to choose the second path. Lerayan felt a surge of hope, and for the first time in centuries, she believed her people might survive the coming war. More than that, She believed they might help build something better afterward. The stars came out above New Haven, and Lyraean could see human ships on patrol and protecting the colony, and the refugees who had come seeking sanctuary tomorrow would bring new challenges, and the Dominion would send more fleets and the war would spread. But tonight, there was peace and hope and allies who understood that true strength came from choosing to be gentle. Lyraean had found what she had been searching for when she came to observe these strange humans. She had found a species worth fighting beside. 3 months after the Second Battle of New Haven, the war had spread across 12 systems, and the Kryn Dominion was fighting not just humans, but a growing coalition of species who had united against their aggression. Lyraean stood in a strategy meeting on Earth itself, and the human homeworld was both beautiful and terrifying in ways she had not expected. Cities sprawled across continents and forests grew between them and oceans teemed with life, and there were billions of humans living in apparent peace. But beneath that peace, Lyraean could see the same defensive preparations that existed in every human colony, and Earth was a fortress disguised as a garden. The meeting included human military leaders and representatives from 6 other species, and Lyraean represented the Silver Moon Imperium. General Samantha Cross was presenting the current tactical situation, and the Kryn had lost over 60% of their fleet in various engagements, but they kept fighting. Counselor Amanda Price interrupted and asked if it was time to consider negotiating a peace settlement. General Cross looked frustrated and said the Dominion had rejected every peace offer, and they were now conscripting civilians from conquered worlds to replace their losses. Amanda argued that continuing the war would cost more lives on both sides, and humans had a moral obligation to seek peace. General Cross countered that abandoning the species who had allied with humanity would also cost lives, and the Dominion would simply rearm and attack again. Later, Katie Brennan, who had been promoted to admiral after the second battle, spoke up and said both positions had merit. She said humans would continue seeking peaceful resolution while preparing for total war, and they could pursue both paths simultaneously. President Helen Wright, who was chairing the meeting, agreed and said humanity would maintain its principles regardless of the cost. Lyraean watched this debate with fascination, and the humans were actually arguing about whether to show mercy to an enemy that had repeatedly tried to exterminate them. It reminded her of debates among her own people before the fall, and the elves had spent years discussing philosophy while their enemies prepared for war. But the humans were different, and even while debating, they were building ships and training soldiers and developing new weapons. After the meeting, Lyraean spoke privately with Katie and asked if she thought they could actually win this war. Katie admitted she did not know, and the Dominion had vast resources and controlled hundreds of systems, and humanity only had dozens of systems plus their allies. But Katie also said winning the war was less important than not losing themselves in the process. Lyraean asked what she meant. Katie explained that humans had won wars before by becoming worse than their enemies, and they had used weapons of mass destruction, and they had committed atrocities in the name of victory. Katie said modern humans had sworn never to do that again, and they would rather lose the war than win by becoming monsters. Lyraean thought about her own people, and the elves had made no such promise, and when the Kryn attacked them, the elves had responded with their own atrocities. She said as much to Katie. Katie nodded and said that was the difference between survival and living, and humans wanted to survive, but not at the cost of their humanity. A new intelligence report arrived, and Lyraean helped analyze it because her centuries of experience with galactic politics were valuable. The report showed that the Kryn Dominion was planning a massive offensive, and they had recalled fleets from conquered territories and were concentrating their forces for a decisive strike. The target was obvious, and they were going to attack Earth itself. President Wright called an emergency council, and the question was whether to evacuate civilians or prepare for defense. General Cross advocated for bringing the entire human fleet to Earth and fighting the decisive battle here. Counselor Price argued for evacuating at least the children and non-essential personnel to safer systems. A woman named Lieutenant Rachel Hayes spoke up, and Lorraine had met her briefly, and she was a tactical analyst. Working with the Fleet Command, Rachel presented a third option. And what if they let the Kryn come to Earth, but used the attack to end the war permanently? She explained that Earth defenses were far more extensive than any colony, and the Kryn would commit their entire remaining fleet to this attack, and if humans could destroy it, the Dominion would be unable to continue the war. General Cross said it was too risky, and if something went wrong, billions of humans could die. Rachel agreed it was risky, but said the Dominion would keep attacking colonies and killing millions until someone ended it. And this might be their only chance. President Wright made the decision, and they would defend Earth, and they would commit everything to this battle, and they would end the Dominion threat once and for all. But Wright also said they would still offer the Kryn one final chance to surrender before the battle began. Over the next weeks, Earth prepared, and Lorraine had never seen anything like it. Orbital platforms that could destroy small moons moved into position, and weapon satellites that had been hidden as commercial infrastructure activated, and entire cities revealed defensive capabilities that had been concealed for decades. The human fleet gathered, and over 200 ships assembled in formation around Earth, and Admiral Lauren Mitchell commanded them from her flagship. Katie commanded a battle group assigned to protect the orbital shipyards. Rachel, Kim, and Vex led a squadron of mixed human and dragon fighters, and Vex had become incredibly effective working with human pilots. Lyrian herself was given command of a small fleet of elf ships that had arrived to help defend Earth, and her people remembered their debt to humanity. The Kryn fleet arrived exactly when intelligence predicted, and over 400 ships emerged from dimensional gates throughout the system. At the center of the fleet flew the Dominion flagship, and Overlord Kranthus himself commanded the attack. President Wright sent one final message and offered the Kryn complete amnesty if they withdrew, and she promised that humans would help them reform their society peacefully. Kranthus responded by ordering his fleet to destroy every human habitat, starting with civilian stations. The battle began. The scale of it was beyond anything Lorraine had experienced, and thousands of ships and millions of beings fought across the entire Earth system. Human weapons that had been kept secret until now unleashed their full power, and energy beams that could boil oceans, and missiles that could crack moons, and electronic warfare that seized control of entire enemy squadrons. But the Kryn had numbers and experience and desperation, and they pushed forward, accepting terrible losses. To reach Earth itself, a massive Kryn battle group broke through the outer defenses and started bombing the surface. Human point defense systems intercepted most of the ordnance, but some got through, and entire cities disappeared in explosions. Lorraine watched from her command ship and felt despair, and the Kryn were willing to destroy everything to win. Then something changed. A special operations team led by a woman named Commander Olivia Santos managed to board the Dominion flagship using stealth technology that Lorraine did not understand. Olivia and her team fought their way to the command center and transmitted a direct challenge to Overlord Kranthus. She offered him personal combat, and if he won, the humans would surrender Earth, and if she won, the Dominion would withdraw. Kranthus accepted, and he was confident in his superior size and strength. The entire battle paused as both sides watched the confrontation. Olivia fought with a skill that came from years of training, and she used speed and technique against Kranthus' raw power. The battle lasted 7 minutes and ended when Olivia disarmed Kranthus and held a weapon to his head. She did not kill him. Instead, Olivia offered him the same choice she had offered before, and surrender and accept peace or die here and let his fleet be destroyed. Kranthus looked around at his damaged fleet and the overwhelming human forces and the allies who had united against the Dominion. For the first time in Kryn history, an overlord surrendered. The war ended, not with total destruction, but with negotiated peace, and the Dominion agreed to release all conquered peoples and submit to coalition oversight and reform their society under human guidance. Lyraean could not believe it, and she asked Katie how humans had managed to win without destroying their enemy completely. Katie explained that the goal was never to destroy the Kryn, but to stop their aggression, and now the Dominion would have the chance to become something better. She said, humans believed that most beings were capable of change if given the opportunity and support. Lyraean thought about her own people and how they had sought revenge against the Kryn for 2 centuries and had never considered rehabilitation. She realized humans operated on principles that were almost alien to most galactic species. Over the following months, Lyraean watched as humans helped the Kryn transition to a new form of government, and human advisors taught them about democracy, and human engineers helped rebuild their damaged worlds, and human teachers educated their children about cooperation instead of conquest. It was slow and difficult, and many Kryn resisted, and there were incidents and problems. But gradually change happened. Vren, the young Kryn officer who had sought asylum months ago, returned to his homeworld as part of the new government, and he worked to build connections between humans and his people. The Kryn who had fought against humanity began to understand that the humans had been trying to help them all along. Lyraean sat with Katie one evening, watching Earth recover from the battle, and the cities were being rebuilt, and memorials were being constructed for those who had died. Katie looked tired and sad and said the cost had been high. Over 10,000 humans died defending Earth, and millions more were injured, and entire cities would take decades to rebuild. Lyraean asked if Katie thought it was worth it. Katie was quiet for a long time, and then said that she hoped so, and she hoped the peace would last, and she hoped the Kryn would truly change, and she hoped all those lives were not wasted. But Katie also said that humans had done what they thought was right, and they had defended the helpless, and offered mercy to their enemies, and maintained their principles throughout the war. Katie said that even if the peace failed, at least humans would know they tried. Lyraean understood, and she had watched humans transform from appearing gentle to revealing their true strength, and back to choosing gentleness again. She said she was honored to fight beside them, and her people had learned valuable lessons about what true strength meant. Katie smiled and said humans had learned from the elves too, and Lyraean tactical experience and historical knowledge had been invaluable. As they sat in comfortable silence, Lyraean thought about the future, and the war was over, but the work of building peace had just begun. She decided to stay on Earth and help with that work, and her skills were needed here more than anywhere else. Vex had made the same decision, and he spent his time with Rachel Kim and other human pilots and teaching them ancient dragon wisdom while learning human tactics. The galaxy was changing, and humans had proven that strength could be gentle, and that mercy could be powerful, and that peace was worth fighting for. Lyraean had found her purpose again, and after centuries of wandering, she had found a home among beings who understood what her people had forgotten. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and the peace would need to be maintained, and old enemies would need to become new friends. But tonight there was hope and allies, and the promise of a better future. 2 years after the Kryn Dominion surrendered, the galaxy was unrecognizable, and species that had fought for millennia were learning to coexist, and humans had become the unexpected mediators of galactic peace. Lyraean stood in what had once been the Dominion throne room and watched as it was transformed into a council chamber, where representatives from 20 species would meet to discuss cooperation instead of conquest. Vex rested nearby, and his massive form barely fit through the doors, but he seemed content and young. Kryn students approached him nervously to learn about history, and Honor Rachel Kim was teaching at the new military academy, and former Dominion soldiers were learning human tactics, and more importantly, human principles, about when to fight and when to seek peace. Katie had been promoted again, and she now coordinated the entire coalition defense network, and her calm competence had made her the most trusted commander in known space. President Helen Wright had just finished giving a speech about the new era, and she talked about cooperation and mutual defense, and building a future where all species could thrive. Lyrian had heard variations of this speech many times, but she never tired of it, and Wright spoke with genuine conviction that peace was possible and worth the effort. After the speech, Wright approached Lyrian privately and asked for her assessment of the Kryn progress. Lyrian reported honestly, and the transition was difficult, and many Kryn still resisted the changes, and some actively worked to restore the old system, but Wright asked if progress was being made. Lyrian admitted it was, and schools were teaching children different values, and the economy was shifting from conquest to trade, and democratic institutions were slowly taking root. Wright nodded and said that was all they could ask for, and change took time, and humans would support the Kryn through it. A security alert interrupted them, and there was an incident at one of the Kryn colony worlds, and a group of hardliners had taken hostages and were demanding a return to the old ways. General Samantha Cross wanted to send in special forces immediately. Counselor Amanda Price advocated for negotiation and understanding, what drove the hardliners to desperation. Wright made the same decision she always did, and they would try negotiation first, but prepare the rescue teams in case talks failed. She asked Lyrian to lead the negotiations. Because her experience and outsider perspective might help, Lyrian agreed, and took Vex with her, and the dragon presence often calmed situations because he was so clearly powerful, but chose to be gentle. They arrived at the colony and found 50 Kryn hardliners holding 200 civilians in a government building. The leader was an older Kryn named Vorthak, who had been a military commander under the old regime. Vorthak demanded that humans leave Kryn space and stop interfering with their culture and let the Dominion return to its traditional ways. Lyrian listened carefully and then asked what those traditional ways had given him. Vorthak listed military glory and strength and unity under powerful leadership. Lyrian asked about his family. Vorthak hesitated and admitted that his son had died in the war against humanity, and his daughter had been conscripted and died in a different campaign, and his mate had killed herself when their home was destroyed. Lyrian asked if those losses represented the glory he was fighting to restore. Vorthak was silent. Lyrian told him about her own people and how the elves had been mighty warriors who conquered systems and imposed their will on weaker species. She explained how her civilization had nearly been exterminated because they measured strength in conquest rather than cooperation. She said her own bonded partner before Vex had died in the war that destroyed her homeworld, and billions of her people were gone, and the Silver Moon Imperium would never recover its former glory. Lyrian asked if Vorthak wanted that future for his people. Vorthak said at least they would die with honor. Lyrian laughed bitterly and said there was no honor in extinction, and honor that required your children to die was not worth having. She told him that humans had taught her something important and true. Strength was not the power to destroy, but the wisdom to build. Vorthak asked why he should believe humans when they were the ones who destroyed the Dominion. Lyrian pointed out that humans could have exterminated the Kryn completely, and they had the weapons and the justification, and instead they offered peace. She said humans won the war, but chose to help their enemies recover, and that was real power. Vorthak was wavering, and he asked what would happen if he surrendered. Lyrian promised he would be treated fairly, and he would face justice for taking hostages, but he would also be heard, and his grievances would be addressed. She said the new Kryn government was not perfect, and mistakes were being made, and some concerns were legitimate, and the system needed people who cared enough to fight for improvements. But she said fighting meant working within the system, not destroying it. Vorthak released the hostages and surrendered himself. True to Lyrian's promise, he was treated fairly, and his trial included testimony about his losses and service record, and while he faced consequences for his actions, he was also given a voice in the reform process. Months later, Vorthak became an advocate for veterans and worked to help former military personnel transition to civilian life. Katie told Lyran that this was one of hundreds of similar incidents, and the galaxy was full of beings struggling to adapt to peace. She said it would take generations to truly change attitudes and behaviors. Lyran agreed, but said she had seen real progress in species that had been mortal. Enemies were now trading partners, and children who grew up now would know cooperation as normal. One evening, Lyran and Katie stood in a park on Earth and watched human children playing alongside Kryn and Elf and a dozen other species. Katie said this was what they had fought for, and this simple scene of different beings coexisting peacefully. She said humans had nearly destroyed themselves, fighting over differences, and they had built weapons that could sterilize planets, and they came very close to using them. Katie explained that Earth had been divided into competing nations, and they fought wars over resources and ideology and religion. She said the turning point came when they finally used their most devastating weapons, and entire cities disappeared, and millions died, and the survivors realized they had to choose between cooperation and extinction. Katie said humanity chose cooperation, and it took centuries to build a truly united Earth. But they did it. She said that experience taught humans that peace was possible even between enemies, and that strength should protect the weak, not exploit them, and that differences could be celebrated instead of feared. Lyran asked if Katie ever worried that humans might forget those lessons. Katie admitted she did worry, and she said every generation had to relearn the value of peace. And there were always those who thought violence was the answer. But Katie also said that was why humans prepared so carefully and maintained such strong defenses. She explained that humans could never allow themselves to be weak because that would invite attack, and they had to remain strong enough that choosing peace was actually a choice, not a necessity, forced by weakness. Lyran understood perfectly, and her people had learned that lesson. The hard way, Vex approached them with Rachel Kim and the Dragon, and Pilot had just returned from a patrol mission. Rachel reported that they had encountered a small pirate group and offered them the choice of surrender or destruction. The pirates had surrendered and were being processed for rehabilitation. Vex added that the pirates were young and desperate, and most were refugees from systems destabilized by the war. Rachel said humans were working to address the root causes and to create economic opportunities and to help refugees find new homes. It was the human way and identify problems and create solutions and help those in need. Over the next year, Lyran watched the coalition grow stronger and more species joined, and the principles of cooperation and mutual defense spread. But challenges remained. Some species resented human influence and accused them of imposing their values. Some conflicts erupted that required military intervention to stop. Some beings refused to accept peace and continued fighting. Through it all, humans maintained their approach and offer peace and prepare for war and use the minimum force necessary and treat enemies with dignity and always try to find a better way. President Wright gave another speech, and this time at the dedication of a memorial for all beings who died in the Kryn War. The memorial listed names of humans and Kryn and elves and every species that fought, and it made no distinction between sides. Wright said that every being who died was someone's child or parent or friend, and every death was a tragedy regardless of which side they fought for. She said the memorial existed to remind everyone that war had costs and peace had value, and the future required constant work and commitment. Lyran stood with Katie and Vex and Rachel and watched the ceremony, and she thought about how far they had all come. She remembered arriving at New Haven years ago and watching humans with confusion and not understanding how they could be so gentle. She remembered the shock of seeing them transform into warriors. She remembered the greater shock of watching them choose mercy for their defeated enemies. Now she understood humans appeared gentle because they chose to be gentle, and that choice required strength. Most beings could not imagine. Katie spoke quietly and said she hoped this memorial would be the last one they had to build. Lyraean said she hoped so too, but she knew that hope was not enough. They would have to work for peace every day and defend it when necessary and teach the next generation why it mattered. Vex rumbled his agreement. Rachel added that at least they were not working alone anymore, and the coalition was strong and united. As they left the memorial, Lyraean looked back at Earth and the planet that had nearly destroyed itself and then chose a different path. She thought about her own homeworld long dead and her people scattered. The elves had been powerful once, but they forgot that true strength was not the power to destroy, but the wisdom to build. Humans remembered that lesson, and they taught it to others. Lyraean had found her purpose, and she would spend the rest of her long life helping to build and maintain the peace that humans had fought for. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new threats and new problems to solve, but tomorrow would also bring new opportunities and new allies and new hope. The galaxy had changed, and species that appeared gentle had proven they were also strong, and the strongest among them had chosen to be gentle again. That was the lesson Lyraean would carry forward and teach to others. Humans appear gentle until they are not, and then they appear gentle again, because true strength was having the power to destroy and choosing to build instead. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in centuries, Lyraean believed it would be better than the past. She had found allies worth fighting beside, and principles worth defending, and a new home among the stars. The war was over, but the work of peace would never end, and Lyraean was ready for that work.